Hello? Hello? Okay. Here it is, Kokoro, Natsume Soseki. I am on chapter 70 something? 70? 70 something? No, I'm on chapter 84 and I'm on page 180 and there's the last page is page 234. So we have about 54 pages left. We're in that final stretch here. I do plan to. I'm gonna finish the book, but I don't know if I'm gonna read everything on stream because I wanna. Ideally, I want to finish this soon because I have some other books that I have in my queue that I want to start reading. So, I'll still read on stream, but I might have to read some off stream as well. Chapter 84. With all this walking, the heat and weariness inevitably took their toll on us. It's not that we were actually ill, rather it was the disturbing feeling that one's soul had suddenly moved on to inhabit someone else. Though I continued to talk to Kay as normal, I felt anything but normal. Both our intimacy and the antagonism I felt toward him took on a special quality that was peculiar to this journey. I suppose what I am saying is that, what with the heat, the sea, and the walking, we entered a different kind of relationship. We became for the moment like nothing so much as a couple of wandering peddlers who had fallen in with each other on the road. For all our talk, we never once broached the complex intellectual topics that we usually discussed. Eventually, we arrived at Choshi, one extraordinary event on our journey I will never forget. Before leaving the peninsula, we paused at Kominato to take a look at the famous sea bream inlet. It was many years ago, and besides, I was not particularly interested, so the memory is vague, but I seem to remember that this village was supposed to be the place where the famous Buddhist priest Nichiren was born. On the day of his birth, On the day of his birth, 2 sea bream were said to have been washed up on the beach there, and the local fishermen have avoided catching bream ever since, so the sea there is thronged with them. We hired a boat and went out to sea. I was intent on the water, gazing entranced at the remarkable sight of all the purple-tinted sea bream milling below the surface. Kay, however, did not appear as interested. He seemed preoccupied with thoughts of Nichiren rather than fish. There was an impressive temple in the area called Tanjoji, or Birth Temple, no doubt referring to the saint's birth, and Kay suddenly announced that he was going to go to this temple and talk to its head priest. We were, I may say, very oddly dressed. Kay's appearance was particularly strange, since his hat had blown into the sea, and he was instead wearing a peasant's sedge hat that he bought along the way. Both of us wore filthy robes that reeked of sweat. I urged Kay to give up the idea of meeting the priest, but he stubbornly persisted, declaring that if I didn't like it, I could wait outside. Since there was no arguing with him, I reluctantly went along as far as the temple's entrance hall. I was privately convinced we would be turned away, but priests are surprisingly civil people, and we were immediately shown into a fine large room to meet him. I was far from sharing Kay's religious interests back then, so I didn't pay much attention to what they said to each other. But I gathered that Kay was asking a great deal about Nichiren. I do remember the dismissive look on his face when the priest remarked that Nichiren was renowned for his excellent cursive writing style. Kay's own writing was far from good. He was after more profound information. I don't know that the priest was able to satisfy him, but once we left the temple grounds, Kay began to talk fervently to me about Nichiren. I was hot and exhausted and in no mood to listen to all of this, so my responses were minimal. After a while, even this became too much of an effort, so I simply remained silent and let him talk. It must have been the following evening, when we had arrived at our night's lodging, eaten, and were on the point of turning in, that things suddenly grew difficult between us. Kay was unhappy with the fact that I had not really listened to what he'd said to me about Nichiren the previous day. Anyone without spiritual aspirations is a fool, he declared, and he attacked me for what he obviously saw as my frivolity. For my part, the question of Ojo-san, of course, complicated my feelings, and I couldn't simply laugh off his contemptuous accusations. I set about defending myself. Chapter 85. In those days, I was in the habit of using the adjective human. Kay maintained that this favorite expression of mine was actually a cover for all my personal weaknesses. Thinking back on it now, I can see his point. But I had originally begun to use the word out of resistance to Kay, in order to convince him of his lack of human feelings. So I was not in a position to consider the question objectively. I stuck to my guns and reiterated my argument. Kay then demanded to know just what it was in him that I believed lacked this quality. "You're perfectly human. Indeed, you're even too human," was my response. "It's just that when you talk, the things you say lack humanity. And the same goes for your behavior." Kay offered no refutation, except to say that if he appeared that way, it was because he had not yet attained a sufficient level of spiritual discipline. This did not so much take the wind out of my sails as arouse my pity. I immediately stopped arguing, and he too soon grew calmer. If only I shared his knowledge of the lives of the ancients, he remarked mournfully, I wouldn't be attacking him in this way. When Kay spoke of the ancients, of course, he was not referring to men of legendary daring and courage. His heroes were the fierce ascetics of old, those mortifiers of the flesh who lashed themselves for the sake of spiritual attainment. He was sorry, Kay declared, that I had no understanding of what anguish he suffered from his own shortcomings. With this, we both went to sleep. The following morning, we returned to business as usual and set off again to plod on our sweaty way. But my mind kept going back over the previous night's events. I burned with regret. Why had I passed up the perfect opportunity to say at last what was on my mind? Rather than employ an abstraction such as human, I should have made a clean and direct confession to Kay. And truly, it was my feelings for Ojo-san that had prompted me to start using this word in the first place. So it would have been more to the point to reveal to Kay the facts that lay behind my argument, rather than belabor him with its theoretical distillation. Our relationship was so firmly defined by lofty scholarly exchange, I must admit, that I lacked the courage to break through it. I could explain this failing as that of I could explain this failing as that of affectation, or as the result of vanity, although what I mean by these words is not quite their normal interpretation. I only hope you will understand what I am saying here. We arrived back in Tokyo, burned black by the sun. By this time, I was in yet another frame of mind. Concepts such as human and other futile abstractions had all but vanished from my head. K, for his part, showed no more traces of the religious ascetic. He too, I am sure, was no longer troubling himself with the question of the spirit and the flesh. We gaped about us at the swirling life of Tokyo, like two visitors from another world. Then we set off for the Ryokoku district, where we had a chicken dinner. So fortified, Kei suggested we walk back home to Koishikawa. I was physically the stronger, so I readily agreed. Okusan was taken aback at our appearance when we arrived. Not only were we black from the sun, we were gaunt from the long, exhausting walk. She was nevertheless congratulated us on looking so much stronger, and Ojo-san laughed at her inconsistency. No doubt it was the combination of the circumstance and the pleasure of hearing her laughter again. But in that moment I was happy, freed of the anger that had plagued me before the trip. Chapter 86. But there was more. Something had changed in Ojo-san's attitude, I noticed. Both Okusan and Ojo-san set about providing us with the female care and attention that we needed to regain normalcy after our journey. But it seemed to me that Ojo-san was far more attentive to me than to Kei. If it had been blatant, it might have made me uncomfortable, even irritated. But I was delighted at how decorously she behaved. She devoted the greater part of her innate kindness to me in a way that only I would notice. Kei, therefore, remained oblivious and unconcerned. A gleeful song of victory sang in my heart. Summer ended at last, and mid-September arrived, the time when lectures would resume. Our schedules meant that once more we came and went from the house at different hours. 3 times a week I returned later than Kei, but I never detected any sign of Ojo-san's presence in his room. Kei went back to turning as I entered and remarking, "Just back, are you?" And I answered with my usual mechanical and meaningless response. It would have been the middle of October. I had overslept and rushed off to classes without changing out of the Japanese clothing I wore around the house. Rather than waste time with laced shoes, I hastily slipped on a pair of straw sandals. Our schedules meant that I would get back home before Kei did. When I arrived, I flung open the lattice door, assuming he wouldn't be there, and caught the sound of his voice within. I also heard Ojo-san's laughter. Not needing to spend time unlacing my shoes at the door as usual, I stepped straight out of my sandals and into the house and opened the sliding doors to our rooms. My eyes took in the sight of Kei, seated as usual at his desk. Ojo-san, however, was no longer in the room. All I caught was a glimpse of her retreating form, obviously making a hasty exit. I asked Kei why he had returned early. He had stayed home that day because he felt unwell, he replied. No sooner was I back in my room and seated than Ojo-san appeared with tea, and now at last she greeted me. I was not the sort of person who could ask with an easy laugh why she had run away just then. Instead, the matter nagged at my mind. She stood up and went off down the veranda, but she paused a moment before Kei's room and exchanged a few words with him. They seemed to be a continuation of their previous talk, but as I had not heard what had gone before, I could make no sense of them. Over time, Ojo-san grew increasingly nonchalant. Even when we were both at home, she would go to Kei's room via the veranda and call his name. Then she would go in and make herself at home. Sometimes, of course, she was bringing him mail or delivering his washing, the kind of interaction that could only be considered normal for those living under the same roof. But my fierce and single-minded desire to have her all to myself drove me to read more into it. At times, I felt she was going out of her way to avoid my room and visit only his. So why, you may ask, did I not ask Kei to leave the house? But that would have defeated the very purpose for bringing him there in the first place. It was beyond me to do it. Chapter 87. It was a cold, rainy day in November. Sodden in my overcoat, I made my way as usual past the fierce Emma image that stands in Genkaku Temple and up the hill to the house. Kei's room was deserted, but his charcoal brazier was newly lit. I hurriedly opened the doors through to my room, eager to warm my chilled hands at my own glowing charcoal. But my brazier held only the cold white ash of its earlier fire. Even the embers were dead. My mood quickly shifted to one of displeasure. Okusan had heard me arrive and came to greet me. Seeing me standing silent in the middle of the room, she sympathetically helped me out of my coat and into my casual household kimono. I complained of the cold, and she obligingly carried in Kei's brazier from next door. Was Kei home yet? I asked. He had returned and then gone out again, she told me. This puzzled me, as it was a day when his class schedule meant he came home later than I. He probably had some business to attend to, Okusan said. I sat for a while reading. The house was still and hushed. There was no sound of any voice, and after a while, the early winter chill, combined with the desolate silence, began to penetrate me. Seized by a sudden urge to be among a bustling throng of people, I put my book down and rose to my feet. The rain seemed to have lifted at last, but the sky still hung heavily, chill and leaden. So to be on the safe side, as I went out, I slung an oil paper umbrella over my shoulder. I set off east down the hill, following the earthen wall that ran along the rear of the arsenal. In those days, the roads were not yet improved, and the slope was a lot steeper than it is today. The street was narrower and not straight as now. As you descended into the valley, high buildings blocked the sun, and because drainage was poor, it was damp and muddy underfoot. The worst section was between the narrow stone bridge and the street of Yanagi-cho. Even in high rain clogs or rubber boots, you had to tread carefully to avoid the mud. Everyone was forced to pick their way gingerly along the long, thin rut that had formed in the middle of the road. It was a mere foot or two wide, so it was a bit like walking along a kimono sash that had been casually unrolled down the center of the road. People made their way cautiously, in single file. I was negotiating this narrow strip when I ran abruptly into Kei. Concentrating on where I was putting my feet, I was unaware of him until we were face to face. Only when I raised my eyes on impulse to see what was suddenly blocking my way did I discover him there. Where had he been? I asked. He had just stepped out for a bit, he said. His reply was typically brief and unresponsive. We maneuvered past each other on the narrow strip of navigable road, and as we did, I saw that a young woman was behind him. Short-sighted as I was, I had not seen her until now, but once Kei had passed me, my eyes fell on her face, and I was astonished to discover that it was Ojo-san. She greeted me, her cheeks slightly flushed. In those days, fashionable girls wore their hair swept straight back from the forehead and coiled on top of the head. For a long moment, I stared blankly at this twist of hair. Then I became conscious of the fact that one of us would have to make way for the other. Resolutely, I stepped aside, putting one foot into the mud, and so leaving a space for her to pass me with relative ease. When I arrived at Yanagicho, I could not think where to go. All possibilities now felt equally bleak. For a while, I tramped despairingly along through the sludge, oblivious to the splashes, then went home again. Chapter 88. I asked Kei if he and Ojo-san had left the house together. No, he replied. They had come across each other in Masago-cho, he explained, so they came home together. I could not really question him further, but over dinner I felt an urge to ask Ojo-san the same question. Her response was to laugh in that way, so I disliked. Then to challenge me to guess where she'd been. In those days, I had a quick temper, and I felt a sudden surge of anger at being treated so flippantly. Okusan was the only person at the table to notice, however. Kei remained oblivious. I was uncertain whether Ojo-san was being intentionally teasing or only innocently playful. As young woman went, she was very astute. But I had to admit that certain aspects of her were typical of the things about other girls that annoyed me. It was since Kei's arrival in the house that I had begun to notice these irritating traits. I was unsure whether to put this down to my own jealousy of Kei or to her awfulness in relation to me. I am not inclined even now to dismiss my jealousy. As I have said many times, I was well aware that jealousy was at work below my love for Ojo-san. The smallest trifle, something that would be quite insignificant to anyone else, could set it off. To digress for a moment, it seems to me that this kind of jealousy is perhaps a necessary part of love. Since my marriage, I have been aware that my jealous impulses have slowly faded. At the same time, I no longer feel that early, fierce passion of love. Hesitant as my heart had been, I now knew I had to gather my courage and fling it down before her. By her, I mean Okusan, not Ojo-san. My plan was to set marriage discussions in motion by coming straight out and asking for Ojo-san's hand. Yet though my decision was made, I still held back from day to day. I know this makes me seem terribly irresolute. I don't mind that it does. But my inability to act did not stem from lack of willpower. Before Kei had appeared on the scene, any move I felt the urge to make was blocked by my abhorrence of falling into a trap as I had done once before. After Kei's arrival, my suspicion that she might be more attracted to him held me back. If she did indeed favor him, I had decided, then there was no value in declaring my own love. It was not so much that the thought of the shame was painful to me. It was rather that, no matter how I loved her, I hated the thought of marrying a woman who secretly longed for another. Many men are perfectly happy to marry the girl they love, whether she returns the feelings or not. But in those days, I considered such men to be more worldly and cynical than we were, or else more obtuse to the workings of love. I was much too ardent to have any truck with the notion that once you marry, you somehow simply settle down. In a word, I had a romantic faith in the nobility of love, while simultaneously practicing a devious form of it. Naturally, during all our long time together, there had been occasions when I could have confessed myself directly to Ojo-san and asked for her hand, but I had purposely chosen not to. I was very conscious of the fact that Japanese convention forbade such things, but it was not really this alone that restrained me. I assumed that in such a situation Japanese, and particularly Japanese girls, lacked the courage to be frank and honest, so I could not hope for a candid response from her. Chapter 89. Thus, I found myself at a standstill, unable to move in either direction. Maybe you know the feeling of lying there snoozing, perhaps when you are ill, and suddenly you find that your limbs are paralyzed. Although you are perfectly aware of everything around you. This was how it sometimes felt to me then, unknown to those around me. The year ended and spring came. One day, Okusan suggested to Kei that he invite some friends over so we could play the New Year game of poem cards. She was astonished when Kei responded that he had no friends. Indeed, it was true. No one in Kei's life really fit the description. He had a number of acquaintances who would pass the time of day with him when they came across each other, but they were hardly the kind of people to ask over for a game of cards. Okusan then turned to me and asked if I knew of anyone to invite, but I was not in the mood for such jolly games, so I gave a non-committal reply. When evening came, however, Ojo-san dragged us both off to play. With just the four of us, it was a very subdued game. Hi, Touchy. Thank you. Oh, my throat. Okay. When evening came, however, Ojo-san dragged us both off to play. With just the four of us, it was a very subdued game. Unused to such frivolities as he was, moreover, Kei remained reserved and standoffish. I demanded to know whether he even knew the Hyakunin Ishu poems. Not really, he replied. Ojo-san apparently took my words to be contemptuous, for she then began to lend him her obvious support. And in the end, the two of them were more or less aligned against me. With any encouragement, the situation could easily have escalated into a quarrel, as far as I was concerned. But luckily, Kei steadfastly maintained his earlier aloof indifference. I could detect not the slightest hint of triumph in him, so I managed to finish the game without incident. It would have been 2 or 3 days later that Okusan and Ojo-san set off in the morning to visit some relatives in Ichigaya. Classes had not yet started, so Kei and I were in effect left to look after the house for the day. I felt no urge either to read or to take a walk, and instead settled beside the brazier, chin propped on elbow, daydreaming. Next door, Kei was equally quiet. Such silence reigned that for each of us, the other could as well not have been there. There was nothing unusual in this silence, of course, and I paid it no particular attention. Around 10 o'clock, Kei suddenly opened the doors between our rooms and stood in the doorway. What was I thinking? He asked. I had not really been thinking anything, or if I had, then I was probably mulling over the usual problem of Ojo-san. Okusan was a necessary part of my conundrum, of course, but lately Kei's inseparable involvement had complicated it further. He had been vaguely present in my mind as a kind of obstacle, but now that I was face to face with him, I couldn't come out and say so. I simply looked at him silently. Kei then strode into my room and sat down in front of my brazier. I took my elbows off the edge and pushed the brazier slightly toward him. Kei began to talk in a way that was quite out of character. To which part of Ichigaya had Okusan and Ojo-san gone? Ojo-san gone, he asked. I said I believed they went to the aunt's house. Who is she? He asked. I told him she was the wife of a military officer. Why had they gone out so early in the year, when the round of New Year visits traditionally did not begin for women until after the 15th of January? I could only reply that I did not know. Alright, this will be my last chapter for tonight. Chapter 90. Kei persisted with his questions about Okusan and Ojo-san. Eventually, he began to ask the kind of personal question that I had no way of answering. I was not so much annoyed as astonished. There was a glaring contrast between his indifference whenever I had brought up the subject of these two on previous occasions, and his very different attitude now. Finally, I asked why he was suddenly so obsessed with the subject today. He instantly fell silent, but his closed mouth twitched tremulously. He never spoke much, and when he did, he had the habit of first working his mouth around. The weight of his utterances was no doubt evidenced in the way the lips resisted his will and opened only reluctantly. The voice that finally broke through was twice as strong as that of an average man. Seeing his mouth working now, I knew that something was coming, but I had no clue what was in store. You can imagine my amazement when Kei launched into a ponderous confession of his agonized love for Ojo-san. I froze, as if his words were a magic wand that turned me instantly to stone. My mouth failed to so much as twitch in an effort to respond. My whole being was reduced to a single concentrated point of terror, of pain. I stiffened instantaneously from head to foot, like stone or steel. So rigid was I that I almost lost the power of breath. Luckily, however, this state quickly passed. A moment later, I had returned to human feelings. And now a bitter regret swept over me. He had beaten me to it. I had no idea what my next move should be, however. I was too distressed, I suppose, to think coherently. I simply remained frozen, uncomfortably aware of the nasty sweat that was soaking the armpits of my shirt. Kei, meanwhile, was continuing the faltering confession of his love, pausing from time to time to grope for words. I was in agony. My distress must have been written on my face as blatantly as some advertising poster, I thought. Even Kei must surely notice it, but it seemed in fact that his attention was too deeply focused on himself to register my expression. Sorry, my throat. His confession never varied in tone. There was a heavy dullness to it, it seemed to me, and a kind of unyielding inertia. While part of me listened to this faltering declaration, my heart was seething with the question, what shall I do? Oh, what shall I do? So that I scarcely comprehended the details of what Kei was saying. The overall tone of his words, however, struck me to the core. So my pain was now mixed with a kind of terror, the beginnings of a horrified recognition that he was stronger than I. When Kei finished, I could say nothing. I was not strung dumb by an internal debate about whether it would be wiser to make the same confession to him or to keep my secret to myself. It was simply that I could not speak, nor did I wish to. At lunch, Kei and I faced each other across the table. Served by the maid, we ate what seemed to me was an unusually tasteless meal. We spoke barely a word during the meal. We had no idea when Okusan and Ojo-san would return. Okay, that is it for tonight, and that's a pretty good stopping point, I think. And my throat is starting to feel pretty dry. I do plan to read more tomorrow. I'm now on page 194, and there's 234 pages, so we are 40 pages away. So I do plan to be back tomorrow. Have a good night. Thank you, Touchy. I hope you have a good day. Alrighty.